Hello and welcome to the Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Allison Gampel, Associate Director of Programs at York University. Thank you so much for joining us today to our session that's titled Queer Representation in Comics and Graphic Novels. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, we'd like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond. The answers are all across. I see those blue lines moving all over the place. Thank you very much. It's helpful for our speakers to know more about who's in our audience. For a little bit of housekeeping, if you need any help with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period. Please note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now, I'd like to introduce our professors, Jonathan Warren and Dr. Allison Halsell. And please forgive me for my dog barking in the background if you can hear it. Professor Warren is an expert in American fiction since the 19th century and the editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. For the past 20 years, he has been the director of York's wildly popular undergraduate and graduate courses on comics, cartoons, and graphic narrative. Our second presenter, Dr. Allison Halsell, is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities at York. She specializes in Victorian and modernist literatures, with a particular emphasis on visual cultures, which include the study of paintings and illustrations, contemporary film, comics, and graphic narratives. Her monograph, Growing Up Graphic, The Comics of Children in Crisis, was just published by Ohio State University Press. Congratulations. Both Dr. Halsell and Professor Warren were co-editors of the first ever collection of LGBTQ+ comics criticism in the LGBTQ+ Comic Studies Reader, which was published by the University Press of Mississippi in 2022 and awarded an Eisner Award for Best Scholarly Work on Comics. Another congratulations. So, to start off today's talk, Professor Warren will present Reading Comics Queerly, followed by Dr. Halsell, who will present Out and Proud, Coming Out Graphic Narratives. We're so pleased that you could both make time to join us today. Welcome, Jonathan and Allison. Let you share your screen, and I'll be back after your presentations for the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Allison. I'm going to share my screen. If you ask comics readers today what they know about gay comics, LGBTQ comics, you're more likely than not to hear back about comics that depict LGBTQ characters or experiences, or that otherwise acknowledge the existence of gay people. So it's representation that tends to matter the most. You're also likely to hear about the sexual orientations or gender experiences and expressions of particular comics creators, the sexuality or gender of creators naturally is thought to extend to make their work count as LGBTQ as well. And we probably take both ways of thinking for granted. When we think, what are gay comics? We tend to think they're comics about gay people or comics created by gay people. But
Jonathan, I'm just
yep,
going to jump in because I don't think your screen share worked
let's
and
try
we don't
again.
want to miss out on the visuals.
Okay, let's
So I'll
see.
let you give it a try again. There we go. Okay, you're up and running.
Okay, I
Okay, and are you able to switch to your
think
next
so.
slides if needed?
Let's see. There we go.
There you go.
Okay, great.
Beautiful.
Thanks for
Okay.
that.
Oh, cool. This was worth waiting for the screen to be shared. So thank
Well, I'm
you.
glad.
Back to you.
The thing about teaching comics is that the visuals are always so magnetic. So it's a relatively recent thing for us to do that entirely natural uh, thing that I just described. When you think about gay comics, you think about comics about gay people or by gay people. It's a relatively recent shift from how gay cultural touchstones have been identified over time. And it's because of an emergence of a critical mass of LGBTQ plus representation in comics and culture generally that has adjusted how we conceptualize gay culture. Until quite recently, objects of queer delight or veneration that even when not always transparently clear products of gay creators or showcases for the considerations of queer lives were also inevitably and even reflexively counted in when they had stirred an undeniable gay interest or prompted fandom among queer people or travestied heteronormativity in some way that was important to a queer audience. And while attending to representation today is one very important way of seeing culture's queerness, we may risk neglecting an influential attribute of LGBTQ plus readers' relation to comics if we don't also acknowledge what's a pervasive and even continuing power of other kinds of queer suggestiveness in the comics from our formative experiences of reading them. Comics that lacked gay representation or the authorship of which we weren't sure about, nonetheless cultivated gay attachments and tastes and shaped queer modes of appreciation and understanding. It's not been until relatively recently that comics readers have been even able to pre-select for comics queerness by way of knowing about whether their creators, what their creative sexuality is, or their depiction or fictionalization of the lived experiences of queerness or queer people. So I wanted to try to account for the idiosyncratic wayfinding that characterized what it was like to read comics queerly before we had that capacity. What kinds of gay fascination could be sustained via, say, the unstated romantic possibilities and permutations in Archie's world, of the Archie, Jughead, Reggie, and Moose variety, in a time before the advent of a character like Kevin Keller, who came out as gay in the pages of Archie in September of 2010, or, say, of Eliza Hann, a biracial pansexual character who came to Riverdale in June of 2022 to hang out with her love interest, Veronica's cousin, Harper Lodge. Though it's safe to say that John L. Goldwater, the creator of Archie's and the founding force behind and the energetically conservative president of the Comics Magazine Association of America, it's safe to say that he was in no way committed to depicting LGBTQ life or to using Archie comics to realize any self-aware queer vision. Gay readers, nonetheless, easily accommodated themselves to his comics, and not merely as publications that lacked gayness. Archie offers readers endless stories in which love-addled teenaged boys regularly fail to consummate their ostensible desires with mostly aloof or otherwise not quite available girls, Betty or Veronica mainly, and are therefore often left to spend time with one another, thereby sublimating their yearnings through varieties of homosocial intensity. Furthermore, the regimented and totalized heteronormative world of the 1960s and early 1970s and comic book Riverdale didn't necessarily feel especially exclusive or restrictive to children who, like so many gay kids of the time, of course, lived in that world and knew the vocabulary of only its pop culture and identified themselves within that world, not necessarily as its exception. The mode of reading that entailed included seeing selfhood, gay selfhood, in cultural artifacts that were otherwise apparently thoroughly dependent on speaking to and cultivating a regularized, non-idiosyncratic straight readership. Even without flagged instances of queer representation, it was hardly impossible to use the tools at hand in a comic like Archie to test queer possibility, just as it was possible to have your G.I. Joe doll make out with your Stretch Armstrong doll. In a world of comics, without today's LGBTQ representation, readers were not without gayness, both as a consequence of their own propensity to see and to unlock or to project queer possibility in or onto materials at hand, and of the comics code's denial and effacement of illicit sex relations or sexual abnormalities and sex perversion or any inference to the same, a regime that ironically displaced sexuality into other narrative and representational registers, including the absent, the unspoken, the unexplained, and the presumptive. And while in so many big and small ways, the post-Stonewall era of gay visibility has made gay life so indisputably better and more secure, the Klieg-lights of today's queer metropolis shouldn't risk diminishing our valuable earlier ability to see and respond to fainter homo starlight in the comics. Indeed, comics' silence about queerness didn't make me wonder after a franker articulation of gay reality. Rather, it conformed to what was and largely continues to be so much of kiddie pop culture's general blandness with regard to sexuality. And that blandness, more than skewed straight, wasn't news. But it's worth noting that though it surely did so, this didn't simply foreclose gayness. Sure, comics' penchant for straight story arcs and motivations was most often so routine as to be stultifying, but that universe conveyed important queer messages despite itself. When Archie panted after Betty, that eager sexuality featured most often to power the engine of the comic's frustration storytelling machinery. And when boys yearned for girls, that paradigm looked to confirm that it was a dissatisfying story of an eternal impasse. In the comics code heavy deferral of all kinds of sexual fulfillment, Archie no doubt thought to present non-perverted sexuality as a tantalizing game of come hither, no wait. But it also represented straightness as endless agony, a kind of candy-colored waiting for Godot that frustrated all who opted to play the game. And what of the fact that even without any ultimate culmination, the comic was so undeniably saturated in a hetero orientation toward one? Didn't its relentless insistence that boys want to be with girls crowd out or holler over or silence or deny any queerness? Well, it didn't really seem that way to a child who enjoyed its depiction of a world where boys weren't disparaged for wanting to spend too much time with girls, and where masculinity wasn't at issue when it responded to the appeal of femininity. It was entirely possible to read Archie comics as a pop literature of prepubescent queerness, in which Riverdale's teenagers were slightly more grown-up avatars of erotically oblivious children. After all, like Jughead, Reggie, and Archie, I too enjoyed the homosociality of witnessing and participating in the emergence of male friends' incipient desires, just as I also appreciated Betty and Veronica, both for their providing access to the playfulness and crafty humor of a girl's zone that I was sometimes scolded for wanting too much of in the actual schoolyard, and for making available, maybe for the first time, ways of seeing boys as desirable. Archie Comics Code era creators may have presumed that their boy readers would identify with the boy characters who lusted after the girls, but they couldn't restrict readers from scrutinizing them not as though they were them, but rather more voyeuristically to enjoy access to the spectacle of other boys willing to display themselves to us while in heat. Likewise, Archie Comics' depiction of Betty and Veronica's side of things wasn't exclusively for girl readers' identification. Whereas the boys manifested a display of lust without a chance for any kind of narrative satisfaction with girls, the girls, for their part, were often shown taking pleasure in the mere knowledge that they were desired. And that seemed to affirm a key feature of gay sexual life at the heart of gay cruising, simply acknowledging a chance for sexual fulfillment, however anticipatory, or deferred, or distanced, or merely prospective, feels tantamount to its accomplishment. That these characters were straight wasn't really any discouragement. Compared to their other appeals, their heterosexuality, though so obviously pronounced, felt pretty meager if it registered at all. It wasn't just that the comic's voluptuous girls were what its frantic boys continually could not ultimately have, whatever that would mean, but that even when their would-be romantic connections didn't fail, they also never really succeeded. They had dates, car rides together, fleeting smooches, what the comics kept calling making time. But none of these dissipated their ever dissatisfied yearning. And as decency norms like those expressed by the Comics Code Authority require the inexorable postponement of characters' satisfaction and extended the euphemism-strewn narration of their desires, it didn't merely tantalize or titillate all readers into accommodating themselves to an obsessively hetero endgame while maintaining an otherwise sexless decorum. Such comics' conflation of heterosexuality as axiomatic, with their decency obligations to cast panting teenaged horniness as a routine non-event where no success really satisfies, together advertised that straight love was only so much fervency covering over the fact that its heterosexual orientation really looked unceasingly hopeless. Certainly its culmination, as beside the point as the prospect of the wily coyote actually capturing, or what, eating the Roadrunner, or of Elmer Fudd murdering Bugs Bunny. In fact, it's not the end game that's fun, it's the frenzy that precedes it. The heteronormativity is just a flubbed sales pitch. Heavy-handed normative story formulas, for there were hardly any others, inculcated a habit of looking further to discern hotness, queerness, gay possibility in silences and indirection. For example, Jughead's relative impassivity marked him as an oddball to other characters who sometimes marveled at what they took as his inexplicable and blasé indifference to girls. Jughead's mostly a foil for their own monomania and their sometimes annoying eagerness that Jughead should rouse himself to be more like them, disclosed less about Jughead, who remained a cipher, than it exposed the fragility of those boys whose girl craziness strangely couldn't brook any dissent. Certainly, Jughead offered up the possibility of opting out of compulsory heterosexuality, or of being a bemused bystander to its displays of narrative curlicues and gags and delays, building up towards a never realized culmination. You might posit such a characterization as the comic's gentle mockery of queerness, or as a caricature of an often sidelined character's non-productiveness and mystifying opacity, a bafflement, moreover, that Archie would usually position its readers to share. In contrast to his active friends, Jughead's lolling about lacked narrative appeal His stillness didn't seem particularly fun. But if the comics were trying to teach young readers that being a queer outsider wasn't as desirable as signing up for the energetic heteronormative game playing, they also prefigured the conclusion of those antics as another kind of death of fun. And so I associated Jughead's quietude not with the queer outside to Archie's pursuits, but with what would be the dissipation of their energy should they ever get where they ostensibly wanted to go. It all made me suspect that Archie's love plots entail the eventual undesirable stoppage of the comic's storytelling and its mildly daffy seriality of revved up boys without girls, of boys who want girls so badly that their stories therefore need always to keep them apart from one another, just enough that that yearning might persist. What would be the alternative to such postponement but the death of the whole enterprise? And I think about those truly sinister final moments of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, when the dunder-headed heroine, Snow White, is roused from her poison apple coma by the prince's kiss. Now think about the end of that movie. She has actually been oblivious to all of the plot that intervened after she bit that apple, ignorant of what we all know about the evil queen's grandiose trickery and the stunning valor of the dwarves and the creatures of the woods, because she slept right through all of her story's most exciting bits, believing wrongly that taking a bite of a magic apple really would make all her dreams come true. How infuriating to a queer viewer to see that just when the homosocial, working class man children figure out how to work together with the anthropomorphic animals, that their whole reason for doing so chirpily abandons all of them in favor of a man she hardly knows, and a castle in the clouds, and a storybook closure that looks more like death than the carnival that we've been appreciating. So who's dopey in this situation, really? Is it the silly dwarf who tries to land a great big fat kiss on her lips? Or Snow White herself, who really misunderstands the potential scale and nature of the erotic, fun free-for-all that she's exiting as she rotates his head down to bestow a chaste goodbye peck on his forehead? Or we might think of the preposterous conclusion of The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy would have us believe that the scoffing of those incredulous barnyard yokels in the final shots back in black and white Kansas is somehow really preferable to the Technicolor movie musical wonderment of her Yellow Brick Road phantasmagoria, or bearable but for the fact that she can now see through them to their gloriously queer subtexts. Obviously, Snow White should have figured out how to stay in the forest, and if the prince really loved her, how could he possibly mind that? The audiovisual hyperbole of Disney's finale couldn't make its lesson in regimented straightness overcome the fact that it is an annoying foreclosure of all the fun that preceded it. And Dorothy appears to have little but homely familiarity pulling her back to Kansas from a dream world that is obviously vastly superior. To sum up, to be taught that one's fondest desires should naturally entail the end of fun adventures, that the pairing of boys with girls or a return to a dreary Kansan farmstead that hadn't been blown off its foundation after all, didn't feel especially stifling or censorious to a young reader or viewer who had never encountered anything else and who'd become accustomed to noticing when a first-order narrative like that was undercut by queer countercurrents and subtexts. While it's refreshing to discover other queer possibilities, these came not merely via the advent of queer liberation in a post-Stonewall pop culture. All that, after all, took so much more time to ramify in the newsstand comics to which I and you all had access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and over to you, Allison.
Thanks, Allison and Jenny, for inviting us. I'm just going to share my screen. Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride.
All right. All right, so today I'll be talking about Out and Proud, coming out comics and graphic novels. This was some of the research that I did when Jonathan and I were assembling the materials that would make up the Eisner Award-winning LGBTQ+ comic studies reader. So in my research on queer comics and on social justice narratives for younger readers, I find to focus on memoir and autobiography. I feel that these two genres are really well suited for narratives of identity development and the exploration of memory. And this is particularly true of American LGBTQ+ graphic novels, which is what I'd like to spend a few moments talking to you about today. So the metaphor of coming out is interesting in this context because of its roots in the coming of age transition that was once signaled by society debuts and debutante balls. More recently, coming out refers to the LGBTQ+ practice of self-disclosure of one's sexual orientation or gender identity. And some of the earliest queer American graphic novels from the 1970s to the 1990s were primarily autobiographical, exploring the social and historical contingencies of subjectivity and identity. Predominantly stories of visibility, graphic novels from this time depict the process during which a character who had not previously been considered gay or lesbian comes out, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And so tension in these narratives centers around what happens when the invisible is made visible, as much for the protagonist as for the people around them. So Ivan Velez Jr.'s Tales of the Closet, as you can see on the left of your screen, a series published between 1987 and 1993, for example, was one of the first narrative series about Black, Latinx, and Asian queer youth looking to educate straight and queer teens about AIDS. Early LGBTQ+ comics were published primarily by independent presses and offer real insight into the socio-political context of the time, like the Stonewall riots, the feminist and civil rights movements, and of course, the AIDS epidemic. Howard Cruz's Stuck Rubber Baby, which is a graphic novel first published in 1995, provides what was then an unprecedented visualization of the lived realities that gays and lesbians experienced in Alabama during the 1960s, as well as the marginalization and violence that they shared with the Black community. It tells the story of a young man by the name of Tolan Polk and is set in the Jim Crow era American South. In it, Cruz correlates his white protagonist's conflicting awakening to his own homosexuality with his partial comprehension of Alabama's racist turmoil and its resistance. Cruz's intersectional analysis of queer lives, not to mention the profound artistry involved in the text's creation, is really what distinguishes it as a comics masterpiece. Interestingly, in 2022, First Second Press issued a 25th anniversary edition of Cruz's graphic novel amidst the escalating episodes of police brutality and the intensification of the Black Lives Matter movement across the US. Many of the episodes in Stuck Rubber Baby continue to resonate with chilling accuracy in regards to contemporary American racial politics and the social and political inequities that Black Americans and people of color continue to live with today. Another important early LGBTQ+ graphic novel is 7 Miles a Second. This one was published in 1996. It's an unflinching indictment of American social policy. And in it, David Wojnarowicz's psychedelic memoir, with art by James Romberger and color by Marguerite Van Cook, dramatizes the social alienation and pain associated with being a queer person living with AIDS in New York City in the early years of the epidemic. On this two-page spread, Wojnarowicz imagines himself as a giant towering over St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Ave in New York City, punching one of its spires in protest at Cardinal Joseph O'Connor's policies on AIDS, specifically his discouraging of the use of condoms to prevent transmission. This imagined act of aggression captures the intensity of rage, hurt, and horror that David has for American institutions that direct homophobic violence at queer people. Wojnarowicz's size in this particular image invokes the collective social body of people with AIDS and their allies, who actually stormed the cathedral in 1989 as part of Act Up, Stop the Church campaign, an event, ironically, or not so ironically, that Wojnarowicz also participated in himself. So in this memoir, Wojnarowicz's use of personal memory links the personal with the collective, as David's activism criticizes the ravaging of communities and bodies by this disease, the fear-mongering directed at the sick, and the homophobic propaganda spread by politicians and doctors about AIDS. Alison Bechdel's legacy in American LGBTQ+ comics publishing is, of course, linked primarily to the recurring strip Dykes to Watch Out For, which was published for over 25 years in alternative and queer newspapers, as well as for her 3 graphic novels, Fun Home, published in 2006, Are You My Mother, published in 2012, and most recently, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, published in 2021. Fun Home, of course, is a coming out narrative central to LGBTQ+ comics scholarship and the comics canon in general. All 3 graphic novels, though, point to Bechdel's propensity for the modes of memoir and autobiography, as she captures the intricacies of her family dynamic, more specifically her relationships with her father, her mother, and with fitness, in the case of the last graphic novel. Fun Home, though, shares with Stuck Rubber Baby and 7 Miles a Second an importance given to memory, visibility, and the self in relation to society. A text about becoming queer, Fun Home contrasts Alison's acceptance of her lesbian identity with her father's closeted homosexuality. Really drills down into Alison's memories of her childhood as she grieves her father after his untimely death or suicide, depending on how you look at it, and revisits these memories for clues to understand him better, or at least try to. For much of Fun Home, Bruce and Alison are foils for one another, inverts, as she calls him, and calls them, inversions of one another. While Alison, as you can see in this slide, attempted to compensate for something unmanly in her father, Bruce tried to express something feminine in her. Bechdel lovingly catalogs the many illusions that her father curated about himself and life, the care he took of his physique, his rigor as a teacher, his emotional distance as a husband, and his gregarious with his younger male companions. Bechdel's excavation of memory looks to understand how her father's life aligns with her own emerging lesbian identity. Towards the end of the graphic novel, Bechtel features this 2-page spread that's, I can only reproduce a few, a fraction of the panels on these 2 pages. But the 2 pages themselves feature 24 almost identical panels that feature Allison and Bruce in the car on their way to a movie screening of The Coal Miner's Daughter. The multiple panels depicting what turns out to be an excruciating exchange about identity and sexuality, full of pregnant pauses, unsaid subtext that underlies each statement that father and daughter make to one another. All this speaks to the near impossibility of communication between the two. And in a way, it's ironic because this was a moment that Allison had planned to use to share details about her own sexual epiphany, and her father sort of co-opts it, and it becomes an opportunity for him to pontificate about his own sexual experimentations as a youth. So the possibility of authentic connection is missed yet again. And Allison and Bechtel, the artist, is left to process that void that remains after her father's death. So as Jonathan mentioned a few minutes ago, with the revision of the Comics Code in 1989 came greater opportunity and greater representation of queer characters and storylines in mainstream publications, leading one critic to claim that queer comics are one of the most vibrant areas of contemporary comics. Tillie Walden's more recent graphic novels feature any number of coming out narratives as well. One of them, Spinning, which is a graphic memoir published in 2017, thinks through the 12 years she spent as a competitive figure skater. Competitive figure skating, with its focus on discipline, strict beauty ideals, and grueling training sessions, provides a really fascinating backdrop against which Walden visualizes her decision to live authentically as a lesbian. Spinning uses the memories Tillie has of the smell of hockey sweat and artificial cold. Doesn't that take you right into the change room? The cliquey girls in the change room, the fears that pursued her to reject the sport. Walden's adolescence really backs up Jack Halberstam's description of female adolescence as the crisis of coming of age as a girl in a male-dominated society, during which Tillie is taught the importance of restraint, punishment, and repression. Early on, she admits to readers, as much as to herself, that she's queer and that, as she puts it, skating presented a strange debacle. I disliked the femininity of it all, yet was attracted to it nonetheless. The conversation she then has with her dad, in which he congratulates her on passing her skating test, I think is ironic, given the fact that she has concealed her lesbianism for years, unable to claim her identity openly. I always pass, Tillie mutters quietly in that bottom panel there. Gradually, Walden visualizes the breakdown of these feelings of repression. Thoughts of Ray, an adolescent whom she meets at school, begin to absorb her. And their sexual experimentation provides pleasure and joy at the illicit, but even more importantly, profound feelings of fear. As you can see there on the top panel, she thinks, I was scared to be gay. I was scared to be in Texas. I was scared of all the hate I saw in YouTube videos and that I knew existed. As you can see on this slide, this is a slide that depicts the final performance, Tillie's final performance in a skating competition. Over the course of all of these little boxes, these little panels, Tilly experiences an epiphany. This is a sequence broken into 24 separate panels that visualizes a breakdown between the skating routine and Tilly's own anxiety and anger, fear that intensify after she falls. Black panels, as you can see there, increase as we read down the page. That black void conveying self-doubt and feelings of failure. The sequence culminates with 4 powerful panels. 3, of course, as you can see, shaded in black, followed by 1 in yellow, whose caption reads, "Get me off this fucking ice." Walden's organizing metaphor of spinning alludes to those, of course, impressive feats of strength and agility that figure skaters accomplish on the ice, and yet their comparatively stationary movement through space as they spin in one spot. This last routine provokes Tilly's decision that skating is not healthy for her, that it's not who she is as an emerging LGBTQ+ person. So as this very, very brief overview has demonstrated, coming out narratives that were paradigmatic of early queer graphic novels oftentimes employed the politics of form to explore queer culture and subjectivity in America post-Stonewall. Such narratives remain a fixture in the genre, including Maggie Thrash's Honor Girl, Elle Nichols's Phlox, a panel of which you can see here, and Maya Kobab's Genderqueer, a memoir, all recently published. And what I've discovered over the course of my research and reading is that as the past 5 years really confirm, LGBTQ+ comics are emerging at a rapid fire rate, one that celebrates the rich experiences of queer life of all kinds. And happily, these texts are no longer strictly dependent on alternative publishing houses. So American LGBTQ+ graphic novels provide a really diverse range of comics expression and speak to readers of all kinds, not necessarily queer. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so very much for sharing. Okay, you've stopped your share. Jonathan, I'll invite you to come back on camera and we will have a bit of a discussion. But first, on behalf of the York U Alumni and Friends community, thank you for your work and for sharing this with us and our community, especially during Pride. As you said, happy Pride, and it's really nice to be here in June. And you know, I as I mentioned when we first met, was a voracious Archie comic reader. I have about 300 Archies, so getting that snapshot into Archie was personally very fulfilling, and you know, have watched Heartstopper and see my kids reading the graphic novels that you've discussed. So thank you for that. We will now turn it over to our audience for questions. And so I just want to give a little bit of info to our audience on how to submit questions. There's a Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen where you can ask your questions, and then I will ask them on your behalf to our wonderful presenters. If anyone is watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions you have through the comment section for the video, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to start with going back in history. You spoke to the 50s and the comic book industry being, you know, convulsed by that morality scandal that led to, you know, the Comics Code Authority. So what was that about? Was there something that started that brought this to be in the 50s?
The Comics Code emerged at this time of profound cultural paranoia in the States, right? It was the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War. And the suspicion in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, militarily, is that what had been conflict between the United States and all of these manifestly visible enemies was replaced mostly by conflict with invisible ones, subversives hidden in our midst, Soviet operatives, communist spies, all sorts of enemies to an ostensible American way of life. And we know from our own experience in our own lifetime that that kind of paranoia tends to grow like a cancer if unchecked. And one of the most fertile grounds for that kind of subversive energy to develop, the fear was in the 1950s, was in the minds of young people. So there was all sorts of scrutiny placed on publications for youngsters that were supposedly communicating subversive messages of all kinds. Whether this was true or not, of course, is up for grabs. And a lot of the claims that were made in the 1950s about comics were grandiose and hard to defend, but they tell us so much more about the culture of the time than they do necessarily about what was subversive in comics, this propensity to see subversion everywhere. And so the Comics Code Authority, with regard to sexuality, the most famous, notorious aspect was that it demonized superheroes. It saw in Superman, a malcontent loner from another planet who could, because of his identity, never form close attachments to women. Or in Batman and Robin, an unhealthy relationship between unmarried men, intergenerational connection between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson, Batman and Robin, and that somehow that this was going to encourage ideas about homosexuality being appropriate in young readers. The folks that developed the Comics Code also thought that, children might jump out of windows, thinking that they could fly because of the superheroes. So the code tells us about a cultural moment of paranoia, but it also does suggest that the readers that developed it saw all of these queer possibilities in this kiddie literature that was very bland, very uh, averse to, speaking to sexuality directly or candidly. Allison, you wanted to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, even with the elimination of the code, what I see this whole conflict centered around is what kids can cope with, and this assumption, this very widespread assumption that kids are innocent and should be and that innocence should be protected. And we can think about that innocence in terms of intellectual innocence, but also in our case, queer or sexual innocence. And so this regulation by the code was very much a tool being used specifically by the adult institutions to make an effort to control what information was available to younger readers. And we see that continuing today, I think, with the ongoing struggles with censorship in schools, school boards, libraries, etc., around the world, very much so in America, but even here in Canada.
Thank you for that. And that perhaps leads to, another question, which is, why have comics often expressed marginalized or silenced voices? Does it have to do with the graphic themselves, or with, comics being sort of outside of the mainstream of literature and art? Maybe you can comment to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think conventional literary forms like novels, biographies, they're very much confined by the demands of form and content. So, the literary novel genre, biographies, narratives about lived experiences, while popular, are not pushing book sales in the same ways that comics and graphic novels are. So comics, for me, offer an alternative, right? Their format is particularly accessible to many more levels and more demographics of readers. Of course, we live in a visual age, as we're told time and time again. And, the graphic format fits right into the needs of readers who enjoy the affordances of, texts that balance visual and literary inputs. I think that's partly why graphic novels are used to explore topics and people who've been traditionally excluded from canonical or more conventional literature, right? These visual formats offer insight, offer original ways of presenting the lived experiences of young people, members of the LGBTQ plus community, BIPOC people, Indigenous perspectives, etc. And of course, the sales figures speak volumes, right? Readers in growing numbers are turning to this format, and the format is seen as more accessible, as I said, and very much responding to the visual needs of our age.
Thank you. I think it leads. I'm going to direct this question to Jonathan. It's actually from a former student of yours, Owen, who says, "Thank you so much for this webinar. I took Professor Warren's class over 20 years ago and still think about it all the time." So certainly you have made an impact. And Owen goes on to ask, "I was wondering if you have thoughts about the representation of queer comics and characters in adaptations of comic books. It seems to me that we've recreated this dynamic of queer characters emerging quickly in indie films, while in more mainstream and superhero film studios have been slow to introduce queer themes."
Oh, that's interesting. Hi, Owen. It's nice to see names emerging from the past of those courses. That I always joke about when professors say goodbye to their students at the end of the term, they disappear into this notional future, and only every now and then do we happen across them on campus or on the street or in venues like this. So it's great to hear from you, Owen. I think that that's right. I think that that's it's savvy of you to have noticed that whereas comics themselves, on their own terms, have liberalized their rationales about representation, have relaxed the comics code that emerged in the 1950s on a number of occasions, the 1970s and the 1980s, and eliminating it almost entirely. Now, the adaptation of comics into movies presupposes a whole other kind of morality code, right? The ratings of motion pictures and the commercial expectations of movie studios to think about what audiences of motion pictures are going to feel most comfortable with. And so while you might see in graphic narrative, in comics, in queer comics especially, a very frank depiction of various kinds of lives and characters, in motion pictures, outside of indie films, as you say, in mainstream motion pictures, there's a norming that still happens, regularization and heteronormatization of these characters, so that when you see queer characters, they tend to be, sapped of sexuality, that they're there to be seen by straight other characters as kind of helper figures rather than main characters, to be appreciated by an audience, the viewership of which is oriented mainly towards straight characters and straight narratives, to allow an audience perhaps to admire their own politics and not feeling averse to seeing those lives, but also not being particularly interested in them. And I think that that's an issue to be taken up with, the morals code for the movie studios in the same way that the comics code needed to be confronted by comics readers.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Okay, so let's turn to the future. And this question comes in from Natalie, who says, "Thank you both for the interesting talks. I'm curious to know, what do you both think the future holds for queer comics? What contemporary texts and trends are you excited about?" Allison, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Natalie. That's a really exciting question, because it talks about the possibility, right? We've seen all kinds of transformation from, some of the things Jonathan was talking about in terms of suggestiveness to more overt narratives that I discussed. One of the things that, if I can suggest, that Jonathan and I were really excited to see was, more and more transnational texts by members of the community. That's still very much in development. But, digital comics and fanzines with their low cost and free distribution, I think have really enabled queer and trans creators to move past the need for publishing contracts and to really have an opportunity to engage directly with their readership, often offering particular and specific representations of queerness. And in The Reader, we explore two quite different web-based comics creations that really hint at exciting possibilities for digital comics creation or production. The first is called Art Queer Habibi, which is actually an Instagram account. You can follow it. It has more than 50,000 followers around the world. And this Instagram account showcases work by an anonymous comics artist that foregrounds diverse representations of queer Arab love in the Middle East. So many of the comics are single panel or portraits that feature romantic couples, drag queens, muscled gay men in Middle Eastern cities from Damascus, Amman, Dubai, Riyadh, Palestine, Beirut, etc., that really visualize and value the really diverse lived experiences of Middle Eastern LGBTQ plus members of the community. So that's one site that we found really exciting, and we included a number of images from that creator in the book. Another Instagram account was the El Solomons, which showcased single panel comics by Jesse Brown that featured the lives of two comedians, Jess Solomon and Eman El Husseini, a Jewish Palestinian lesbian couple living in New York City. And this Instagram account really uses the digital medium to reach followers to highlight opportunities for cultural humor that this intersectional couple experiences. So both of these sources for digital comics really speak to how queerness resonates for members of the community and characters around the world. So I think the digital realm is really where the future lies, Natalie. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think that the most fruitful area that I'm interested in is the manner in which comics from all over the world are now disseminated so much more easily because of the internet. And Western readers are, really voracious consumers of manga and anime. And we definitely saw when we were putting together The Reader that not only do we see the influence of manga style in Western comics, we also see so many comics in the West pondering what it means to deploy styles from the East and vice versa. And I'm really interested in comics queerness that are thinking about modes of queerness from away, manifesting in styles of comics from where we are locally or from away, and how those intersect, this kind of blending of styles from around the world, mindful of the sources of origin and interested in all of those international modes of communication and translocality. Found that just fascinating. In the generosity of that work, but sometimes even as a scholar, and Allison knows this, sometimes in the sheer, colonialist cringiness of it. When I, would read some comics from North America that, deploy Japanese modes in a way that seems like completely, acquisitive and exploitative, and then those that will reflect on that tendency. There's this really international dynamic that's going on, sometimes mindful, sometimes not so. And I think that that interaction is really the future of it. And it's because of the digital accessibility. And I was just thinking this week with Apple's, latest launch of their, self-fashion or, AI and emojis where you can basically turn yourself into a comics-like avatar and design your own emoticons. That it's AI that's going to transform all of that in the next phase that we're not even aware of yet.
Absolutely. So curious to see where it will go. And Nick is asking an interesting question about that pertains, applying it to our academic world. Nick says a very interesting talk and thanks you both. Any thoughts about graphic novels as an alternative or additional approach to communicating research findings as a research output?
I have a great example of how that can work, maybe not queerly, but medicine is starting to make use of comics in terms of helping to convey the risks and various attributes of medical procedures to general people, lay people. And the studies have confirmed that a mix of word and image is very effective in terms of conveying, is more effective in terms in helping readers retain more information in contrast to a strictly literary document. So.
Well, thank you. Okay, so we're actually a minute over time, but if you still have another minute, I would like to see if we can answer these last two kind of fun questions. If anyone, is that okay if we stay on for a few
Sure.
more minutes, Jonathan and
Sure.
Allison? Okay. And if there are any burning questions for the audience, please type them in now, and we'll see if we can get to them. I'm going to ask a fun question from Ethan. Have either of you written a comic? And if so, what is it like, or what might it be like? You can choose to answer that or not.
I am not an artist. I wish I were. And I like those books that feature panels, but I sadly, I wish I could mix my creativity with my research, but I'm not that person.
It's funny, that question makes me think about that time in our recent history as educators when smart classrooms got smart with technology and all of us started to use PowerPoints. It used to just be you'd walk into a lecture theater and there might be an overhead projector. And if you were really cunning, you might show up with a wax pencil and some plastic transparencies to try to entertain. But now, of course, there's a real premium placed on translating verbal communication into some sort of pictorial equivalent that will hover on a screen behind you. And whenever I go into designing a lecture or an interactive seminar for the first time, I am thinking in terms of graphic narrative. What image goes with what I'm saying? Because I hate those PowerPoints that are just replications of the text. I'm speaking out loud and here's what I'm saying on a slide. It's just so deadening. I like the mixture of verbiage and imagery. So in that way, I suppose I'm performing the same sort of work that goes into comics narrative. And if I were like any comics, I haven't created a comic of my own, but I think that I would start there to think through how comics practice is already at play in my own life, and to think through how the paradigm of graphic narrative isn't foreign and needs to be imported in order to tell something about what I'm doing, but it's already native to what I'm doing. And I might tell the story of what it's like to be a university professor of comics through a comic. It's a great idea.
Yes, absolutely. And it's true. I hadn't thought about that in presenting it. It's almost unacceptable to present without a PowerPoint, and a good PowerPoint would have graphics. Thank you for that context.
Sure. I mean, I'm always showing images like Lucy Van Pelt with a thought bubble above her head, talking about how that works semiotically. And I'm standing there with a screen above my head, and that's my thought. So there's a kind of iterative repetition to that.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have Michelle who's asking for some recommendations, thanking you both, of course, and asking if you have any top favorite graphic novels, and recognizing Michelle had Allison for their graphic narratives for and about children in 2021, and it created the start of their love of reading graphic novels. So thank you for planting that seed in our students, and Michelle, thank you as an alum for coming back and wanting to learn more. So any recommendations for top comics, graphic novels?
Michelle, it's so good to hear from you. Oh my gosh. Um, I remember you asking me for such a list a few years back. And I think I mentioned Fun Home, and I think it would resonate with you if you haven't already read that. But I also have discovered of late, and I've just finished writing about The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen. Really think that narrative is quite clever, and also Messy Roots, Memoirs of a Wuhanese American. I'm really quite fascinated by these emerging narratives of Asian American youth, and oftentimes their intersectional experiences with queerness. Thanks, Michelle.
That's a great such set of suggestions. I mean, we're all just walking, talking bibliographies when it comes to this. I tend to love The Last Thing That I Taught, just because talking about it makes it so much more lovable. Even a book that I might feel, is traumatic or unpleasant. I see ducks sitting on your shelf right behind you, Allison, which is such a great graphic narrative, but it is a very difficult one. And if you haven't read it, Michelle, I encourage you to pick up Ducks. That's a great one, a really fantastic Canadian story and an important one, but also very triggering narrative and a traumatic one. I tend to recommend to lay people who are coming to comics for the first time, with that in mind, two American graphic novels. Again, not particularly queer. Jimmy Corrigan, The Smartest Kid on Earth by Chris Ware, which, as I celebrate to my students every time I assign it, this is the most relentlessly depressing graphic novel you will ever read. And it is, it's so ponderously sad, but so beautiful. And then also Black Hole by Charles Burns, which is a black and white graphic novel, uses no color at all. It looks like woodcut etchings. It's realistic, but also fantastic, magical, but also medical, and contemporary, but timeless. And it's about specific real world health concerns, but it's also a sort of monster movie. So Black Hole, I would suggest and recommend. It's a titanic achievement and a beautiful book.
Awesome. Well, thanks for all the suggestions. And Owen just typed into the Q&A, a slight aside for anyone who hasn't checked out Fun Home. There's a musical. That's a wonderful adaptation in their opinion. So thanks for the recommendation. Okay, audience, don't send any more questions in. We do have to wrap up. And so we'll end with the last two questions, and maybe we'll try to do them a little bit more quickly. Coco is saying that I'm currently creating a trans-focused graphic novel, and I wonder how and whether to depict violence and the rise of the extreme right. Can you speak about the place of violence in queer trans comics? Do we want to take that one?
Yeah, I
Of
think
course.
I think it's an important question. And I mean, violence, I think, is something that both of us tackle with regards to visual narratives all the time, because they are somewhat omnipresent. I think it's important to acknowledge that violence, but that violence can also be represented in different forms to avoid some of the more triggering representations of say, physical or sexual violence. And part of me really enjoys a graphic narrative that manages to make me think about violence differently instead of relying on sort of that more, if you will, sensationalist representation of acts of aggression against other humans.
I think that that's right. I often tell my classes that, of course, comics from the very beginning have been uh, forums for the depiction of violence, whether it's slapstick or conflicts between superheroes and supervillains, when we're thinking of it as narrative violence, or just formal violence, the kind of garish colors, the shocking pacing, the sensational visuals, the jarring and eye-catching transitions or juxtapositions between pictures and words can be thought of as violent. And you can harness those energies to tell a story about trans experience without resorting exclusively to the realistic depiction of violence, a literalistic depiction of violence, to think about how formal features can be visually violent. And then I wouldn't want to, hold you back from occasionally and with narrative purpose and responsibility, depicting violence. Violence is a feature, alas, of queer experience, trans experience. And you uh, if you modulate how often you decide to go literal, the literal presentation of violent experience can be that much more powerful. It can be as truly shocking as you need it to be, if it's not gratuitous or overwhelming, but about the experience of being overwhelmed and about the experience of uh, being treated gratuitously, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for those perspectives. And to Coco, we look forward to reading your novel when you're done. We'll turn to the last question, and I won't read the whole thing. It's coming from Vesper. Vesper's asking, is there anything that you would comment about how the way we're choosing to communicate our stories, what that reveals about the stories themselves, or the authors themselves? Are there any trends that emerge, patterns in the choice of art style of queer comics? So any last thoughts that you want to, well, not last thoughts forever, but thoughts that you want to share before we end our webinar today?
One of the things that I especially appreciate about queer comics is just how there isn't one signature style or approach. And so if to Vesper's question, I think one of the many things I've noted about queer comics is just how diverse they are in terms of their formalistic approaches as well as their stylistic approaches. Some of them are aesthetically pleasing, some of them not, some of them are more representational, some more iconic. And that kind of opportunity that they make use of is specific to some of their more independent presses, alternative means of publishing, right? Once you start publishing in the more sort of accepted publishing houses, those stylistic features become a little more challenging to enjoy as a creator, I think. And so I think that's one of the means or one of the reasons why I so enjoy like the zine format or the digital format that doesn't have to go through those mechanisms that shape and can standardize representation.
Yeah, we're really just all over the place with what's available right now. So I couldn't generalize on, particular styles about queer comics presentation, but I do think that it's a very helpful diagnostic when meeting a scholar or creator for the first time to say, tell me a little bit about the queer comics that you like, not just the stories that you've responded to, but the visuals that you like, and then to press on that a little bit. Allison and I did this with the reader when we interviewed a number of creators about, not just the comics that they wrote about, but the ones that they really liked growing up. And I found that those conversations were so wonderfully, weirdly revealing. Uh, some of the scholars of Marvel comics in particular, superhero comics that had to conform to a corporatized house style that didn't seem particularly explicit, were to the eyes of some of our contributors, amazingly sexual and erotically charged. And I didn't see those possibilities until I saw them through the eyes of some of those scholars. So I don't know, there's not one way in, and a corporate style isn't necessarily as averse to alternate points of view or alternate sensibilities as you might think. Um, I think opening our eyes to the variety and hybridity and multiplicity of queerness in comics helps us see even the most kind of conservative, old-fashioned comics as potentially very queer, and the newest stuff as rip-roaring and, fascinating and exciting too.
Thank you. Well, I would say this was definitely a rip-roaring, fascinating, and exciting conversation. Allison and Jonathan, thank you so much for being here, for staying way over time, and thank you to our listeners for being here as well.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
So at this point, Allison and Jonathan, you can turn off your audio and video, and I just have some closing remarks for our audience. Okay, if you have been able to stay, we have one more poll question for the audience. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion? It's popped up on your screen, so take a moment and answer. The Scholars Hub will be back next Wednesday, June 22nd at noon. Join us for a conversation that's titled Partnerships for Safe and Sustainable Transportation with Alison McPherson, who's a professor in York's School of Kinesiology and Health Science within our Faculty of Health. To register for that event and learn more about upcoming sessions, please visit, as always, yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you again, Allison and Jonathan. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.